Bad morning to y'all. We got fucking through another week. So that's a good thing, I think. Um it's
That's
debatable
three.
though whether or not it's a good thing to get through the week though. I mean, there might be something at the end of that week that's regrettable. Why not just like stay in bed, not get out of it ever, and like play video games on our phones? That sounds like a good rest of my life. I'll just retire now. Um anyway, fucking this is the community episode, and this is the episode where we take the links that you wanted us to read, and the stories that you all wanted us to cover, and cover it on the show. Also, keep in mind that if you have an exclusive you want us to cover, like if you want to come on for an interview to discuss one subject or another, we're also open to that. And there are many other things that we could do with this show. It's got a lot of applicability and malleability. So, with that in mind, we've got quite a few links coming in from Google Plus, and one of the links is related to something that we'll hit immediately after I get done with housekeeping, and it's related to the BBC and climate change. So obviously, that's going to be a fantastic way to start this. So, without further ado, let me just say this is brought to you by Brave, and that is the ad resistant, track resistant browsing experience. It's also brought to you by the Cash App, which is a dollar and Bitcoin wallet that you can use a Visa card with. And see, I'm already having a bad morning. I fucking woke up pretty much now. Um, so I'm fairly like slow right now. But anyway, and also Liberty mugs. Mugs that you can use to consume fluid and also piss off your coworkers. I, however, am drinking from an energy drink can right now while Lupinit starts off the day's news.
Yeah, I'll jump in before you fall asleep, mate. Right, so to start with, this is a follow-up article from one shared to me by Jeffrey Hamby and this one's from The Guardian. The core article came out of What's Up With That link regarding a philosophy teacher rebelling against a publicly debating climate deniers, and decided to go into the raw article itself, because this is an opinion piece from The Guardian originally. So this is what the whole rebuttal was. I won't go on the BBC if it supplies climate change deniers as, quote, balance. The science is not in doubt. So the corporation no longer needs to give them a platform. All right, so here's the article. Like most screens, I typically jump at opportunities to go on air. Pretty much any opportunity. BBC National Radio, BBC TV, Channel 4, Sky. I've done them all over the years for good or ill, even when, as is not infrequently the case, the deck is somewhat stacked against me, or the timing inadequate for anything more than a soundbite, or the question up for debate less than ideal. But this Wednesday, when I was rung up by BBC Radio Cambridgeshire and asked to come on the air to debate with a climate change denier, something broke in me and rebelled. Really? I thought. This summer of all times? So for the first time in my life, I turned it down. I told her it will no longer be part of such charades. I said that the BBC should be ashamed of its nonsensical idea of, quote, balance. And when the scientific debate is as settled as the, quote, debate about whether smoking causes cancer. FYI, it isn't, but we'll get into that in a minute. By giving climate change deniers a full platform, producers make their position seem infinitely more reasonable than it is. This contributes to the spread of misinformation and miseducation around climate change that fuels inaction producing from the long emergency we are facing. From a public service broadcaster, this is simply not good enough. What makes it so frustrating is that there are important debates to be had around climate change. And so I told the Beeb that I would be very happy to come on and take part in a different debate. For example, we should be debating whether the climate cause is going to be enough or if we need to do more. Or discussing just how radically society needs to change to meet the challenges of climate crisis, and how we should rethink our activism. But I'll no longer put up with the absurd notion that a straight debate about the science can be justified, especially given the fundamental truths that we've known for decades even. That even if there was a real room for doubt science, we should still take radical action to safeguard a livable climate on the basis of the precautionary principle. This principle of international law states that in absence of certainty about risk of widespread and catastrophic harm to the environment or public health, ought not to stop us from taking preventative action to head off such pretentiously ruinous harm. That's not a law in science. BBC Cambridgeshire is based in Cambridge, the science capital of the UK. I expected better from it, especially after this well-publicised ruling this year. The way the BBC has been promoting climate change deniers on air is no longer acceptable. In the end, the broadcaster went ahead without me. Much of it wasn't bad. The scientists interviewed were excellent. But the framing of the debate was awful, and framing is everything so far as the message that most listeners receive is concerned. The producer introduced the segment by asking, is climate change real? The journalists doing vox pops bombarded ordinary people with canons such as, maybe it's just a natural cycle. And of course, a climate change denier was given a huge and undeserved platform on an equal basis to his opponent. In August 2018, this is unacceptable, and it seems that quite a lot of people agree with me. However, here's the exciting thing. If we get more momentum behind the idea of refusing to participate, it will force a change of coverage methods by the BBC, which experts have been calling for years. If we all refuse to debate with climate change deniers on public platforms and press the BBC to catch up with the 21st century, it will be forced to change its ways because the BBC cannot defend the practice of allowing a climate change denier to speak unopposed. If we truly want to see change on this issue, we need to be willing to let it know exactly how we feel. So now I'm going to get on with filing my official complaint to the BBC. And this is from Rupert Reed, who teaches philosophy at the University of East Anglia and chairs the Greenhouse think tank. Now, dear Rupert, there's a fundamental flaw with every single model to deal with anthropogenic global warming, which is what people deny exists. Nobody is denying, to my knowledge, within the scientific fields, that climate change occurs. It occurs. There are many, many processes behind it, the vast majority of which are naturally occurring. They are solar or they are geo-based forces that have far more of an impact than humanity has ever had. Life has not ended because of those changes over time. It is just evolved and adapted and changed. This is natural. This is normal. This is how things are supposed to be. The mathematics behind climate change have some serious flaws, specifically in calculating for what the temperature of the Earth should be. Now, most people will then go, oh, but it's using physics equations that have been settled for decades or for ages, and there's anybody claiming this is denying science. And to my knowledge, nobody claims that that function is wrong. Its usage may be wrong for what they try to use it for in some cases, but the actual function to calculate for the total temperature of the planet isn't wrong. However, what they do say is they treat the planet as if it's a flat disk absorbing the sun's light. Now, anybody with a basic understanding of geometry, or anybody who has been, say, in the field of 3D graphics, will tell you that light does not hit a sphere in a consistent way. It has an arc that it follows, and depending on your position within that arc, you will get a different intensity of light from every other position, with the exception of the poles, which are getting the absolute minimum amount of light that they can. That is true for the planet. That is true for any spherical object. So the measurement that is used in the calculation right now is a 1/4 calculation as the constant, because it's interpreting it as surface area. And it should be 1/pi, which would be the arc curve and how it would absorb across the entirety of the arc as an average. And if you spin an arc in a circle that is perpendicular to its axis, it will create a sphere. So it works, this principle, 100% of the time. And that heat absorption difference creates a 50% reduction in the problem itself, as reported by the mainstream media and climate alarmists. Now, if they can't even get that basic geometry right, and they can't even get that basic level of logic right in the declared calculation that is even currently right now existing on Wikipedia, you can look it up. If you can't get that right, why should anyone assume any of the other bits are right? If the fundamental, how hot should the Earth be naturally, is wrong. And we're still too hot, according to that calculation. I'm not denying that we're still too hot, but it's half as important as they're making it out to be.
But see, like, here's why this debate should happen. Because, like, if you're expressing a scientific idea through a model, first off, it shouldn't happen on BBC. Public debates should be reserved for things like philosophy, not science.
Yeah, it should be something like Monk. The Monk debates are pretty good, but they need more scientific ones.
I mean, the Monk debates aren't even very good. Because, like, let's be completely honest. If you looked at the Monk debate for Peterson versus I forget his fucking name, but he's the guy who called him a mean mad white man. And
I'm not saying all
argument.
Yeah, I know. I'm not saying
moderators
that
the moderators on the Monk debate sucks, and the moderators on the Monk debates suck, and a debate's only as good as its moderator. The point of a debate is that it's a moderated contest of ideas, and if it's not a moderated contest of ideas because the moderator isn't moderating, then it's not a good debate. So I wouldn't say the Monk debates are good. I would say that those are more like a public masturbation session.
Fair enough.
But this is because if you did have a competitive scientific model, it would be interesting to see your scientific model go up against their scientific model in a laboratory setting, perhaps publicly, but like you exchange papers over a public forum or write competitive articles or something similar to that, because there might be a way that they could explain why their ideas comport well with that.
Yeah, but even they admit that it doesn't accurately predict the temperature of other planets and that they don't fully understand the mechanics of it. They admit that for Jupiter.
Well, I mean, yeah, but the other planets aren't in the Goldilocks zone. And
I realize
the question isn't whether or not the planet can survive with that level of CO2 or whatever. The question is whether or not it will fuck up the living environment.
No, I get that, but the problem is if they can't even get it right for other planets, and they know they can't get it right for other planets empirically, then why are they presuming this function works for Earth? That's the bit that concerns me, is everybody basically going, "Oh, it must work." Well, it really is
because what exists on Earth, because what exists on Earth has different metrics, especially since the life on Earth has different capabilities for thriving and failure.
No, I realize, but again, this isn't, why should we presume its accuracy is valid if we know that a 3% error, at least in the initial calculation, which when you're talking about temperature in Kelvin, means that you've got a 50% reduction in the actual problem. If you've got a 3% difference, that's not insignificant when you're talking about something of this nature. You should be looking at significances of, ideally, one or exact. Being able to get the number exactly right would be far more of a valid metric.
I mean,
within 0.001.
Well, that's not exact, though. That's the point. Science always has room for error, and that's the reason it's science and not dogma.
I know, but it's still this is the problem. There's room for error, and then there's saying something is established science, which is a bandwagon fallacy. Saying that because lots of people agree with me, it's true. That's not logical. These are things that are arguments that they use.
That's not what they're saying, though. What they're saying...
Well, actually, it is in that article.
No, it's not what they're saying. What they're saying... And I know it's in that article, but what they're saying by saying it's established science is like they're not saying because other people have said it, it's true. They're saying because it's been tested in model after model, it's true. And
Yeah,
that's
but
what
those
established
models
science
haven't.
means.
Yes, I understand that, but
Not
those models haven't been proven to actually work or predict the future accurately.
well, they don't
That
need to
is
have
another problem.
they don't need to have 100% predictive capability in order to be established scientific models.
But they can't even predict historical accuracy. That is another major
Well, I
complaint
mean,
of the people arguing against this.
yet, but that's true of
That no no
most.
no no.
No, hold on. No, hold on. That's true of most science. Most science has a period where it goes that it goes through where it refines its numbers until they comport with like widely available historical fact. And then when you add to that the fact that a lot of these models rely on information that is ever expanding and growing, rely on curves that are just now being established because effectively humans haven't been industrialized for that long,
Mm.
especially in the terms of the course of history. If you're trying to prove some sort of man-made climate change, you need to have some sort of capability to understand that that man-made climate change is going to be separate from history. And it's not like
Strictly
they're starting with their conclusion and then arriving there. But
no.
it's like but it is like they're effectively trying to prove why it's suddenly getting so much hotter than it was, because it
Mhm.
is.
I'm not denying that it is. The climate is changing. Nobody, I think, as I said, the climate changing itself is not something scientists deny. And it's not something I deny. I just deny what the presumed cause is of quite a large amount of it. It requires a number of things to be true that are not, like an isotropic sun, which is basically everything in equal measurement, including power output, which doesn't occur. It varies over a cyclical period, and we are in a solar minimum, I think, at the moment with regards to sunspots. And it's things like this that do vary over time. You can't just average them out, you've got to factor them in. And you can, because they can be measured and predicted, just like most of the other variables that physics has to deal with. It's just
Well,
bad
right.
maths.
But that doesn't mean that they're wrong. It just might mean that they need to factor more in order to refine their point. And in fact, once they do, it might come out with a model that cements their ideas and doesn't go against it, because it might come out with a slightly, lower and or higher number of actual degree variation that wouldn't exist without human interference. So I mean,
Well,
there's plenty of opportunity here for testing, but to just simply say that they get it wrong without letting them like spend the amount of time necessary to test it, or without testing it yourself, because I'd love to see your models meet it out, and I'd
well,
love to
I've
see
not
that you hit
created
on.
my own climate model, mate. I've just basically checked the maths of the core models and compared them with geometry, which has mathematical principles behind it that have
I
been
know.
established for thousands of years.
Well, I mean, you just came on the bandwagon there, by your own
Well,
admission. But like
to
either
be
way,
to be
like
fair, I've been watching it for a while,
yeah,
and
but
I've been
so
watching
have
the
they.
denials. And but they're just basically the claims at the moment from
So,
this
so you can
specific
talk about it.
article. From
I,
this specific
I
article.
recognize that, but you're talking about the reasons people are denying that climate change is, happening for this reason and this way, and then you're using the same sort of reasoning that they are for their conclusions to be meted out. It's something
Well,
worth mentioning that you're saying established science isn't a good thing to use as the backing for what you're saying, while also saying that it's established geometry that proves your point.
okay, it's not just established, it's been logically cemented and proven beyond all reasonable and any doubt. There is 100% accuracy with this kind of activity. There are
Well, right.
there are certain fields that are known, and there are certain fields that are under discovery. Geometry is a known field. Physics, climate, all the other sciences that we don't know everything about are under discovery.
Right, but
Geometry is not a
isn't-
science.
But
It is a form of mathematics. It's a very different thing.
okay, but mathematics is the science of numbers, effectively.
No, it isn't. It really isn't a science
is.
of numbers. It is a study, but it is not a science of numbers. It is a process that you go through. You have a logical proof. People have had to prove what 2 plus 2 equals, and they can't just say 4, and it's incredibly complicated. You have to use things like you have to prove that 1 does not equal 2 first, and things like that. It's very basic sort of stuff, but you have to do this if you're a mathematician. And by doing this, you can claim with 100% certainty X is true. And that has been done for geometry.
See, first off, I don't understand how maths isn't a science if maths is specifically the discovery of numerical functions and the testing of those numerical functions to make sure it's meted out. And I'm also not sure how effectively geometry can account for essentially global patterns, because what we're discussing here is something that is a chemical reaction and is essentially that chemical reaction interacting with a complex set of atmospheric reactions, and that isn't a geometric equation anymore. That's a chemical equation.
Hang on. The core equation for calculating temperature as a whole for the planet, the expected temperature, has nothing to do with chemistry, has nothing to do with atmosphere. It is very simple No, please, let me finish. It's a very simple planetary body calculation. It's incredibly simple.
If you're discussing CO2 and whether or not it has an impact on the environment and climate over time, and whether or not humanity has effectively increased the CO2 level and therefore damaged the environment, it's a chemical equation.
Okay, but if you're arguing that the planet's getting hotter by X value, and that value is massively overrepresented simply because of a geometric mathematical error that you have committed in your initial formula to say how hot the Earth should be, that is a major fundamental flaw.
To see your model. Which is why I'd love to see your model, which would exist without that, quote, fundamental error, which is why that would be interesting.
The very basic change that you can make to the existing model, there's a number 4 in a denominator within the model. Change that to pi, and you fix 50% of the problem away instantly, and it's that much more accurate.
Well, okay, but you would have to prove why you needed to change that.
Mathematics, I've already explained that. It's an arc curve that light would be absorbed onto, not a flat disk extrapolated into surface area of a whole sphere.
Or maybe it's not an arc curve either. Maybe
it is an arc curve. It's been proven to be an arc curve in other forms of geometry.
The Earth is an oblate spheroid. The Earth
works for any cylindrical.
The Earth isn't even perfectly round. Like,
it doesn't have to be. It just has to be spherical. Not the same
arc universal. It's not a perfect sphere. It's not spherical. It's an oblate spheroid.
It's close. Okay, let's put it this way. It's close enough to a sphere for it to apply, and it applies significantly better than just using surface area of a sphere.
Okay, but the fact that you're using geometry, which requires an arc curve on a planet with a surface that's not an arc curve and is in fact extremely jagged with many faults and peaks, and the fact that you're
the surface of a body.
So I'll interrupt you too. No, you're interrupting me, so I'll interrupt you too. So the actual surface of the Earth onto which the atmosphere clings, that is not an arc. And the fact that these light waves reflect off of certain particles and reflect back to the external space, that only has so much effect, and it has its majority of its effect at the highest like atmospheric levels. Once it permeates down to the ground, the like elevation levels, the proximity to oceans, the proximity to fog banks, effectively, tree cover, all of this has impact on whether or not that specific biome has a positive or negative reaction to that light wave. And the
Okay.
arguments of many climate scientists effectively try to find out how much those things are being damaged on an individual level, because they're considering the planet's ability to filter this CO2 through those plants, through those different biomes. And if it can't, then there's going to be a huge layer of carbon dioxide on the atmosphere that the atmosphere might not be able to properly handle. And there might be a huge amount of sun getting through that atmosphere, especially like in certain biomes, because CO2 coming from humans would come from specific hotspots on the planet, would possibly, and this is something that they're still testing, but they still have a decent amount of reason to believe is true, would possibly cause damage to that particular area of atmosphere, and enough damage that the rest of the atmosphere would not be able to move in time, and there would be holes in things like the ozone layer and all of this other stuff. I mean, theoretically, the holes in the ozone layer that they were discussing during Inconvenient Truth have been sealed up. But that doesn't mean that there isn't a general climate sort of malaise or climate damage because of humans. It doesn't mean that humans aren't causing that. It just means that maybe they're not causing it as much, which I think scientists are actively open to. But this guy seems to be arguing against the idea of debating somebody who denies the idea of climate change. I'd have to know what his proverbial opponent had as his model. I'd also have to know whether that guy's model was the same as yours before claiming that this guy was wrong for not debating this other guy. When this other guy's model might not even be the one that you're saying proves this guy wrong.
Can I clarify something as well? I don't have a model. I don't know why you keep saying my model or his model or anything like that. This is not. No, please. You
asked me a question. You're saying you don't know why. Yes, I haven't finished.
I'm explaining to you why I don't understand the question or the statement, because I'm not talking about models. I'm not.
He is. So are you making a straw man fallacy?
No, I am making an argument that any AGW model has a fundamental mathematical flaw at its core.
Then you would present a counter model.
No, I don't have to present.
That's how science works.
If I'm trying to prove that my model is better than their model, if I'm just trying to disprove that a model doesn't work or an entire theory doesn't work, I don't have to present a counter theory. I can just go back to the null.
Okay,
that's how it works.
Here's the thing.
That's how science works. No. Yes, it does.
No, you're interrupting me. You've done this quite a bit. Science doesn't work like that. Science isn't a matter of just saying no. What science is a matter of is saying no, and this is the better explanation, and this is why. If your operant conclusions do not work in a model, then they are wrong as well.
Science works from a null hypothesis, always. They are claiming that the null hypothesis
it doesn't end there.
It starts there, and therefore if you disprove a claim, it goes back to the null as the proof.
Except
you have to go back to disprove
your claim has
the
a
null.
Model, because otherwise yours doesn't work either.
Only if you're trying to prove my model for climate change under AGW works better than theirs. I'm trying to say the models based on AGW will never be accurate because they are fundamentally flawed. And if you factor in all the variables that If you factor in, please, mate. If I'm not going to interrupt you, you've got to stop interrupting me when I'm talking on this, because
Okay.
I'm really trying to explain to you why the null is not climate change, and they are making this claim. This is what this guy is doing in this article. He is claiming the null has been settled as climate change. Everybody agrees climate change happens.
He didn't say that. You're straw manning his entire position.
No, actually, he did say that. He said, everybody, this is settled. It is not something that anybody reasonable believes, and therefore they should just be ignored.
No,
this is the problem.
They should just be ignored. He didn't say that everybody believed it. He said it's a settled science. You can say that without saying everybody agrees.
Quote, I said that the BBC should be ashamed of its nonsensical idea of balance when the scientific debate is as settled as the debate about whether smoking causes cancer. That is a null. That is a null now.
It's not everybody.
Smoking causes cancer is a null hypothesis in science. He's making the claim that climate change is a null hypothesis in science if he's saying it's equitable to that. That is a claim I can make logically.
You're saying everybody, you're using straw man. I'm not going to move on while you're trying to debate. You are.
I'm not saying everybody. I'm saying no.
Everybody. You said everybody. You said that's what he was saying when he didn't say that. He said it's a science, and he said it's a settled science because many scientists have gone over their model and proven it to their satisfaction, which effectively isn't saying everybody. It's saying a predominance of scientists haven't found the flaw that you're discussing, which is why you need to present a counter model. They at least have a model, and if you're going to prove an element of their model wrong, it has to work in a new model. Otherwise, it doesn't work either. You can't start with that conclusion that their model is incorrect because of the numbers, and then not present a counter model where that number works in the real world. Because this is the world that they're talking about, and if your numbers don't fit, then there's something wrong with your numbers.
But I've done that. I've given you a formula. I've given a formula. There is an existing formula
for your number to work.
I don't. When you call it, can you define what you're using the term model? Because model means something very specific in science, and I think you're misusing it here badly.
Well, okay, so describe why you think I'm misusing the term model.
A model is a basically a mathematical diagram, something you feed data into and then produce over the top of to get a prediction of what you can make. You can use mathematics, you can use live data, use a little bit of a mixture of the two to try and learn what happens over time. That is a model. What I'm talking about,
it's designed to make it simpler. Your model involves, and you do have one, you're just not expressing it. A model explains how numbers work when interacting with other numbers, because it's all data in the end, right? Science is all data, and a model expresses that data in a way that that data is interacting with enough other data to prove that it works.
Okay, but this is the problem. A, it empirically has not been proven to work, and B, it has fundamental mathematical flaws in working out what number it should be trying to be at instead of what it is at now.
So you would have to add that to a model to prove that their model was incorrect.
Now, I've already stated that if you take into account that there's a 50% reduction if you use pi instead of 4 in that fundamental function.
But you haven't described why they should do that, which would be a model.
Because of geometry, because of basic understanding of how physics
So build
works.
a geometric model. Build your geometric model. In fact, do it in Unity, because they have a bunch of assets with predefined environmental factors, and you can demonstrate why somebody was wrong.
Have you visited, I'm going to make a plug for a scientific website that I know of called Principia Scientifica, Because all of this stuff that I've been talking about is there, fully described in papers, some of them from mathematicians, physicists all over the place.
See, and it would have been much more interesting if you had started with that, and we probably could have gotten to other stories sooner, because you would have been able to say, this is where this number comes from, check out their models. I'm going to check out their models now.
Yes, please do, because they've already stated that their models do work better than the existing ones. And they are based on the idea that it's mostly natural, with very little impact being done by the people on the planet.
And
the most impact we do is where we build cities. That generates a thermal, basically, location for the air temperature to increase significantly.
Hotspots, like I said.
Yes, like Nevada and Las Vegas. That is a hotspot in Nevada.
Now that we've gotten that particular thing like settled, I'll look over that information over the weekend, and the audience can as well, whatever audience we still have anyway. But that's the thing you have to do. You have to show a competitive model, because if you don't have a competitive model for a modeled scientific idea, then your idea has flaws that you aren't looking for. That's part of science, is to reference the idea that you present against a model. And if you can't reference the idea you present against a model, then there is something wrong with your idea that removes its like essential esoteric qualities that make it valuable.
I'd just like to say, again, it's not about models, it's about hypotheses. No, it's about hypotheses.
Your model is about the result of a tested hypotheses.
Yes, but the core hypothesis has to be true. And the core hypothesis has to be backed by maths first, before you even go into the models.
And proving
that's the point.
And proving that the maths are incorrect or correct is what forms the basis for a model. So I'd like to see these people's models.
That's fine. And I'll give it Principia Scientifica. They've got quite a wide range of people, some of whom have been very avid climate science deniers, and some of whom are specific in very niche fields of physics and mathematics that discuss these things and have shown that it's absurd. It's in order to believe that function works, you have to believe almost that the Earth is flat. That is why I am so avid about
and you've already said this. But that effectively says that the climate science people, that the anthropogenic fucking I think that's how you say that one.
Yeah, it is.
Climate change is the result of a flat Earth. You would be saying that their models require a flat Earth when they don't agree with that, and you would have to prove that then. So I mean, it'd be and like I don't see anything for Principia Scientifica. I see something for Principia Scientific though. Is that what you're talking about? That's probably
it. Yeah. I thought I may have added the A.
Okay. Well, I'm on their site now, and I'll we got to move on to actual news shortly.
Yes.
That one was barely news to begin with, but it's also not what this show's theoretically about. But like all I'm seeing here so far is a bunch of essentially clickbaity titles over articles that are written in blog format. Like I don't see any specifically like scientific things here, much less scientific research papers. So it'd be interesting to know.
Well, no, click through to some of them have links in them that you have to click through to if you want a scientific paper on the issue. Some of them are just mathematical diagrams of how it basically worked, but they do have some model that they're working on. Exactly, but they do have one of the diagrams of the specific issue I've been discussing with regards to the shape of the planet and basic geometric principles. And as well as that, they have several on the ones that they've been working on specifically and why they work better.
Okay, but
you just have to look through them.
First off, the actual Principia Scientific endorsed thing is a 45-page PDF written by an astrophysicist. So already we're starting off very strong with somebody who's not a climate scientist, who doesn't have a degree in climate science.
Appeal to authority.
No, it's not an appeal to authority any more than him listing his astrophysics degree as a fucking appeal to authority. Fuck you.
The fact that he has an astrophysics degree means he understands the physics behind
It means
planets.
he understands. No, that's not what astrophysics means. No, that's not what
And
astrophysics
stars,
means. Astrophysics,
celestial bodies.
specifically star physics, astrophysics. That's
And
not
that
what
has no
planet
impact
are.
on climate.
No,
That
you're
has no
ignoring
impact on
it.
climate.
You're using fallacies, man. You're using
Mate,
fallacies. Attempt to call me on fallacies I didn't use.
Mate, you're saying that because he's not a climate scientist, he shouldn't be talking about climate change.
No, I'm saying that we're already off to a strong start in a sarcastic way because
Yeah,
we're talking
that's-
to an astro. No, hold on. Because we're talking to an astrophysicist about the way Earth works. This guy could probably tell us a decent amount about how stars work. But in terms of how the Earth works, he's possibly got some faults. And that's all I'm saying. And I'm not even
Okay.
using that as a way to poison the well. I'm just saying that basically he's starting off from a perspective of his master's in astrophysics, and
Yeah.
that's not a great start for discussing atmospheric tendencies on a planet. Especially since when you start to study stars primarily, you have a different sort of atmospheric interaction with anything else.
Yeah, but there's still the factor of the sun, mate. It still drives the climate. Anyway, I thought we were getting off this discussion, and you were going to look at this in your own time, not during the stream.
Well, right, and I will, and I am, but the only thing I'm saying, because I don't want this stream to seem like it automatically endorses this, this publication, this essentially publishing house, of these specific anti-climate change models. I wanted to look it over before we just let that hang in the air. I do think that people should look this over on their spare time, and I know I'll be reading through this paper over the weekend. But effectively, I see that as an immediate flaw, that we're talking to an astrophysicist about whether or not the model for how Earth behaves is specifically valid, because we're discussing the Earth here. That's where the word geo comes from, not where the word astro comes from. And if
No, I understand that.
And if we're discussing this, I'd like to see him prove that his effective knowledge is better than the effective knowledge of the people who have studied Earth specifically.
All right, fair enough. But I still think to harp on about which specific field that person is from
Why?
is an invalid argument.
It's not.
Because it's
not.
yes.
No, if I'm a dentist,
It's an appeal
if I'm
to a form of
dentist-
authority.
No, it's not. In any more way than him listing that he's an astrophysicist is an appeal to authority. It's not an appeal to authority in any more way than him listing his degree is.
How?
Because I'm just discussing the fact that his degree might be in a field better suited to other scientific inquiry.
Does that make it invalid for him
I
to
didn't say
discuss
it
climate
was.
change? I'm asking. That's why, because it's not clear to me. Because you made it sarcastic,
man.
because you made the sarcastic comment about that, I don't know
wasn't
what
an
your
appeal
view
to
of it
authority.
was.
It wasn't an appeal to authority, because what it was me discussing the fact that maybe if he had a degree in another field, he could understand Earth better. I didn't say that he didn't understand it well enough for climate change. That's just a chink in his proverbial armor. It's why I'm not an astro-fucking-physicist, because I didn't have a degree in astro-fucking-physics.
All right. As long as it's clear, I just want to make sure we're not just blanket discrediting this source because it's not climate science.
I didn't discredit shit, dude. I just said that we're off to a great start in a sarcastic way because he knows more about the stars than other celestial bodies.
All right.
I mean, unless you're going to say that his university was wrong and he knows more about Earth, in which case they gave him the wrong shiny piece of paper.
No, I'd say that he probably can still speak on planetary bodies because a lot of the functions that control that, like, are used in Astrophysics. A lot of them were discovered by astrophysicists.
Okay. Well, a lot of them can have been discovered and useful in astrophysics, and still, an Earth scientist would know more about the Earth than a solar scientist.
Possibly, yes.
Most
But-
likely, yes. You're not being scientific in your acceptance
Okay,
of this.
yeah, all right, most likely, yes. But would I say that that means that one should consider their word more credible than someone else in a different field? I'd weigh them up I'd try to weigh them the same, to be honest, if I'm quite frank.
Then, I mean, that's not a very scientific way to go about that. Knowing what
It's-
somebody... No, hold on. You've interrupted me so many times. Knowing what somebody knows because they say what they know, and then making a judgment about whether or not they have an understanding of what they're discussing makes sense. You're going to talk to a psychologist about what problems ail the mind, not a fucking seismologist.
No, obviously. But when you've got interrelated fields, mate, here, you've got fields that relate to climate change. Climate change is not a field in its own right. It's a collection of other fields that feed into it.
Well,
That's
right,
the
but
honest truth.
Most of those fields in the honest truth are primarily related to the gaseous interactions on Earth, not the ability for the sun to have an effect on the Earth. Most of these things are just, hold on. Most of these things are related to whether or not these light rays are trapped by gas, not whether or not these light rays get in at all. So if you have these light rays trapped in increasing volume by gas, then that will heat up the fucking planet. If that happens, and certain gases trap heat, especially heat from a light source, better than other gases. This has been something proven time and time again. And even if you're right about the numbers being wrong in this particular case, which again, I'm going to look up their model because they include a link to their model, which is why it matters to like ask for somebody's model. If you have access to their model, you can then figure out whether or not their numbers comport well with that model, figure out why their numbers might be bunked because it doesn't comport with the model, or figure out why their numbers are better because it has a model which better explains the atmospheric conditions and why things seem to be getting much fucking hotter. That's why it fucking matters. And it's also why it matters to consider the guy's degree. Because effectively, what we're discussing here is a degree. We're discussing what somebody knows, how they know what they know, and then beyond that, how they know that their model is superior to the other model. And if you do that, you have to have a way of demonstrating that. And I would also, if we're discussing this on a you and me level, because I don't have a degree in mathematics, and I don't, and I'm not a mathematician, I'd love to see you explain why their numbers are something you hold in such high regard. I'd love to see you tell me why you believe their numbers, because that's a separate subject entirely. If you want to talk about appeals to authority, to say that it just should be pi because these people had a different model, that's much more of an appeal to authority than anything that I've said or that this other guy said. That's creating like what is that? Fucking Principia Scientific as a new authority.
No, that's fair enough, and I'm not making that claim because when I read the article, I went into the paper, reviewed the logic of it, the hypothesis, the analysis of it, double-checked it, did the maths myself, reworked the equation with the new point in the calculation, and found that, yes, I could repeat that process and come up with the same result, and it made more sense as a base level to be able to predict the temperature of the Earth. Now, part of the problem I have with climate science in a large way is the assumption that we are currently too hot for it to be natural. And that is the assumption.
The assumption is that it's not natural because of the curves that they have observed historically, and because of the fossil record that shows these curves weren't this dramatic in the time of the dinosaurs, for instance, when the heat did eventually become a problematic thing enough to cause mass extinctions of species.
Again,
It's not just saying it feels too hot. It's saying this is why it seems too hot by our numbers.
Well, these numbers have been bandying around since. I think we may need to change this one from Bad Morning News to Bad Morning Climate Change Gate.
Well,
let you know.
I'm gonna retitle the episode to reflect the fact that this effectively turned into a climate debate. But
yeah, I mean, my apologies to everybody because I really did not want to go into it that much when we got into this, but I feel like because I did review those papers and have basically absorbed everything I can from them, I mean, there were so many different ways it appeared obvious to me that this is a fundamental issue.
Well,
it's the difference between looking at the face of a circle and the edge of a circle, that kind of issue.
Okay, so what would be interesting is if you wanted to do this, if you proved their mathematical models, not only that they meted themselves out, but that they also applied to this specific climate, you could do that in video form and submit it to the Bad Morning News YouTube. And then we could have that on the record, you know, in terms of actually being able to prove the statements that this publication made are valid. And that would be something I'd like to see, because I'd like to see why you came to the conclusion that what they said was true, because that's what it ultimately boils down to. If you're talking about skepticism, you have to be willing to be individually skeptical. And me, I'm skeptical of both sides here.
No, that's fair enough. I mean, from my perspective, in full disclosure, yes, I don't agree with AGW. I do think the climate's changing, but I think there are a lot of other factors that are causing it. Pardon me. One of the major issues I have with this whole debate, though, in general, is the fact it is a political debate in the end.
And I do agree with that.
Yeah, it's... And from a science perspective, the number one sin you can do is make it political. You cannot politicize science for it to be objective. Otherwise, the money gets in the way.
Well, not just the money either. The fact that people will polarize based on, you know, whatever they feel is their appropriate due. Like we're talking about, like, effectively the left. Is the biggest proponent of AGW, right? So
yes,
we're talking about people who essentially package it like a cargo cult. Like, if you support gay rights, then you obviously support this. So, or if you support abortion, then you obviously support this. So, I mean, that is a problem, and you know, I would never deny that it wasn't, especially since I'm anti-political. But what we're discussing, like, and this is why I had to go into such detail, because I don't want this show to start seeming unnecessarily partisan in that favor, because effectively, once you start to be unfair to the people you disagree with, you're not being scientific anymore either. And that's the only point I was making here. Like, if you want to disprove this guy, you've got to who says that, you know, the scientific, like, debate is already effectively settled. Not necessarily that it's never going to be disproven, but that it's already settled, because that's what settled means. It's that while there might still be some debate, the general consensus is X. But if you're going to say that he's wrong, you have to present a competitive model to what has already been established as effective. Taking out one of the planks and saying that effectively this plank isn't effective enough at describing the rest of it to be effective, while not also proving that that isn't effective enough to still be worthy of consideration. You know, maybe it's not as bad as the climate scientists are saying it is, but that doesn't mean that it's not really fucking bad. It doesn't mean that the alarmists here aren't actually, like, just a few notches away from being correct. It doesn't mean that both sides couldn't use refinement. It doesn't mean that this guy's side is right at all. And that's what debate requires. And if you're going to criticize this guy for not debating effectively on climate change, because it's quote settled science, then you also have to criticize anyone who cites Principia Scientific as their primary model for saying that climate change is bullshit.
I call it a resource more than a model in its own right, because
They disagree
again,
with you.
well, they've got a model. They'd call themselves probably a non-profit organization.
Well, let's see about that.
Specifically,
Go ahead, though.
I mean, if you go into the About section, they've got an entire thing behind their philosophy that's dedicated to Karl Popper, and that's what actually attracted me to it.
It's legally registered in the UK as a company incorporated for charitable purposes. So
Yes,
they're not a non-profit necessarily. Oh wait,
Well,
there we go.
Yeah.
It is a not-for-profit community interest association. There we go.
Yes. So it is a non-profit, and it is basically, to a large extent, dedicated in some way to Karl Popper, who is one of the greatest scientific philosophers, basically. He came up with the proper way to use philosophy, or the philosophic principles of science was in a huge way influenced by this man. And he was one of the ones who basically said that science is never settled. And from my perspective, it is anybody who says the science is settled on this, unless they can say there is basically appealing to some sort of tradition, more than actually trying to say that this theory proves this is true. And
well, it proves that like in terms of saying that, it's not saying that this theory proves that it's true. It's saying that this theory has great explanatory power, is the way that I always had it explained to me.
That's probably a better way of saying it, actually. But I mean, you can say it as this theory I'm using is true, because there's truth and then there is accuracy. So to say something is true, that like the climate is changing, yeah, that's fine. To say that it's AGW is to increase the accuracy of that truth. Now, I argue that the sun drives the majority of the climate, and there are a shit ton of other variables that we could take into account and potentially prepare for. But whether or not we should then try to mitigate it is a wholly different issue, especially if we didn't cause it. Because then you get into all the whole chemtrail nonsense that's out there, and I don't even want to go into that one. So it's...
Well, sure.
I mean, I don't even know where to start with that one. I don't even have a side for it. But I don't agree with like geoengineering planet Earth. It's done a pretty good job of itself ever since I've been alive, and ever since most of us have been alive. And we've done a good job of making it better for us. And now we need to do a good job of making it better for everything else in our environment. And we're at a position where we can start doing that in a very big way, because we understand the world a lot better than we used to. Things like carbon taxes and all of the political means to solve a problem like this, like CO2, which, again, this specific site uses a number of arguments to say that it isn't actually a major factor in any way, shape, or form, because it's the misuse of certain physics principles. So again, those articles are quite heavy and they do take a while to read. But if you can get through them and you're familiar with like some basic principles of mathematics and some advanced principles of mathematics, you'll get there in the end, especially if you reference Wiki as well. Because let's be fair, the science sections of Wiki are pretty good at giving formulas. So you can actually see what things are.
then you have to prove that their formulas come from a reasonable place, though.
Yeah, but the formula,
like their formulas still have to have citations. So
true. I mean, the formula. Well, they have to at least be logical, from my perspective. If they've at least got logic and they are mathematically sound, that goes a long way to say they should work.
But Wikipedia isn't a mathematical publication. Wikipedia is an encyclopedia designed for, citable sources.
True, but it has those formulas that they use today. At least it has, shall we say, the established formulas, the current presumed nulls. Personally, I think a lot of nulls we need to stop presuming are true, because I think we're going to find a lot more reality bending ideas out there that are actually true that we haven't considered before. But we won't be able to accept that until we start testing those things properly and actually dedicating either funding or private investment into it. But things like climate change divert all of that away. And if it's something we can affect, then let's affect it. But if it's something we're less likely to affect, we should dedicate less time to the problem. Because if we can't fix it ourselves, why keep spending time? If you can't fix something, why worry about it?
And like, I understand what you're saying, but like, there's also the fact that, like, effectively what we're discussing here is a political issue at this point, which is your primary concern with it, which means that it also has the other side of that political issue that could possibly be funding sites, even like fucking Principia Scientific. So Principia Scientific, and I just Googled their donors, and I couldn't find a list of their donors yet. So it'd be interesting to know who's donating to Principia Scientific and what like ideas came about when those donations happened. Because if you start to look at where the money is, yeah, it might make it seem as though fucking climate science, in terms of the promotion of AGW, is a theory based in politics and not science. But you could also make the same counter argument if they made their donors list public, which it doesn't look like they do.
Well, I'm not certain about the funding for that site, to be fair. I do believe some of it was funded by one of the original founders of it, who then moved on to disassociate his name from the institution itself. So they had something to start with. Because it was his name was bad press, basically, if I remember correctly. So he did it for the good of the organization, basically, rather than for trying to basically say that I proved this was true. He backed off to actually get them to do the job that that he was helping them do in whatever way he could. But that is, to be fair, that is my memory. It could, and that's purely from memory. I could be wrong on that one. It was a good few months since I last read their About section. But it is, I find its doctrine very compelling. I find its mathematics very compelling. And the basic principles that it tries to explain in measured terms with like empirical data proving these things are true, it's very convincing to me when I'm reading through it that there are many, many, many holes in the presumption that AGW works as a theory, and it's probably one that needs serious peer review from unbiased fields, ones that don't really care about climate science, but care about the actual formulas in use and can validate that they're being used correctly, that there are no limitations to them. Because there's some formulas that only work in vacuums, there's some formulas that only don't or only work when they're not in a vacuum. So it's that kind of principle. If you're misusing one of those in the calculation for CO2, for example, then it may not be valid to worry about that in any way, shape, or form. it may be
Right.
more valid to do a totally different type of calculation
Which is
and
why
to
I'd
take
like the
CO2 out of the
people who
calculation.
which is why I'd like the people who support this source, including you, to
Mhm.
prove that it works on an individual level. Because, like, it seems in a lot of ways, in many of these cases where you have an anthropogenic climate change denier um, saying that this model doesn't work or that these numbers don't work, a lot of them, what they do is they do the same thing that many pro climate change people do, which is they just throw a paper at somebody and say this proves it. And I don't want, like, if I'm going to be clear, I don't want, like, what's supposed to be a somewhat objective news show
Mhm.
to automatically, like, accept anybody,
No,
but
that's fair enough.
much less, like, just because uh somebody happened to not want to debate somebody else on this topic, who that other person doesn't even seem to accept these models specifically. I'd love to know if that other person that he was going to debate was one of the people who promotes this site, because if
It could
not,
have been.
then it's not even relevant to the story. But, like, secondarily speaking, um, it'd be interesting to know if this person can prove that the model works, why and how. Because if you don't prove that your model works, you're not being scientific. You're just essentially throwing babies out with bathwater. You're throwing out entire theories because of a limited data set, which doesn't work in a model that you propose. And I'm not saying you're doing that. That's a general you, more like a royal you. But
Okay.
people have a tendency to do that, where they don't provide a competitive model that has better explanatory power. And that's not science.
Okay. I would say it's part of the scientific process because I'll say it for this because of gravity. The discovery of gravity from Newton worked very well up to a point, and then it started to fail. And people started saying, this isn't working as well as we were expecting to. We thought there'd be more to it than this. And it doesn't work at all at the atomic level. Why isn't this impacting anything for atoms? And that's when Einstein came up with his theory, because people were asking those questions. He thought, well, why? What does it do at these levels? How does it work? And he modified the theory so that when you use the theory and reduce it to a Newtonian level, it returns Newtonian mathematics. But if you take it to a different level, you can discover black holes exist, and you can discover the fundamental nature of space-time.
Theory, right? That's what you're going to bring up?
Well, no, I mean, I don't know if the next step is quantum gravity, basically. That is the next level. How does gravity work at a quantum level?
Well, right. And, but you're you're gonna then say that effectively, and I'm saying this because I've been looking into this a lot lately. You're saying that effectively Einstein's model might also be inefficient because it doesn't prove why light moves the way he said it moved.
Yeah, it's basically, that is true. Basically, Einstein's model has reached its limits to a large extent. And we now have two separate sets of equations, one in quantum mechanics, one in general relativity through the standard model, that are combined. But there's more to unlock in there, either extra equations or a simplification of the existing one, or just more depth in what is there now. So it's something we haven't quite found yet. There are a lot of people looking for it, and I personally think the ones that have testable theories are the ones that'll actually get somewhere in the end. Sorry, string theory guys. But I mean, my personal interest one du jour at the moment, I think it's called quantum loop, or loop quantum gravity, which is but starts discussing on the nature, the fabric of space itself as a quanta, and that
right,
one,
and as a series of essentially to break it down in a way that most people would accept, a triangular pyramid.
yeah,
Like everything's
basically a bunch
pixelated.
of pixels. If you imagined infinite resolution practically to Planck time and Planck space lengths, which are so small nobody could ever imagine it properly. Imagine a dot on a screen and then expanding that out repeatedly like you would in one of those fractal GIFs, and then eventually reaching a final dot. That would be what we're talking about here. That's the level of each pixel of the universe. So we are in an incredibly high def resolution, and that's why space works the way it does. We can move in it because it's flexible enough for us to do so. It has its limitations, but they're quite robust. They only break down with black holes and big bangs and things like that at the moment.
Well,
but even that science isn't settled. That's the point. Science is never settled. And anybody saying it is really should look into what science is about.
Well, I mean, science from Popper's perspective in this case. I mean, because Popper insisted that you can't make you can't claim something is settled, and you can't make unfalsifiable claims. Which I like that idea, but it's still just a component and a possible like application of science. It's not like the only one. It's not like that's settled. But like, okay, so let's get to some of these chat comments and then call it.
Fair enough.
Finian says there are too many variables for them to create a good model.
Yes.
The same is true for weather. They can make very good guesses, but that's it.
Yes.
I would agree with that. But at the same time, they're presenting a model, and somebody else has to present a counter model. Otherwise, it's specifically not scientific. He said the models are a joke. Suspicious Observer goes over this stuff well. So I guess everybody check out Suspicious Observer. Note that I don't endorse that person because I've never spoken to them or seen their stuff before.
But, I think I have. I'm not sure how good they are. I have to recall.
But definitely check them out if you're into this subject. And what are we doing? The worst thing.
Any more comments?
This is from Kitty Cat, which I believe is Adam Cat on Twitter. It might be fucking Anarcho Kitty or fucking Agorist Kitty. I tagged both of them on Twitter. But that person says the worst thing that can happen is we're going to destroy humanity. Life will still go on, and I agree. I think that humanity is practically overstayed their welcome, but that's my particular misanthropic way of thinking.
Hey, I went off this rock one day.
Finian says math is 2 + 2 = 4. They move on and never question that again. Science always questions over and over everything they discover. 2 + 2 = 4 will always be true.
Yeah,
I don't know.
That's the difference between maths and science.
And he says science based on lies isn't science either. And I agree with that. But if you prove that it's a lie, that's valuable. If you just say that it is, or accept somebody else saying that it is without checking what they said, it's not very valuable. And that's what I'm here for. I'm here to like be sort of an anchor there to say that people shouldn't just accept what somebody else says. I don't know what he was saying. I don't know what he was saying no to, but he said it twice and in increasing caps lock. But
it was probably when we got heated, mate, and it's calmed down a bit since then. And it's shit like this happens in debates, especially with anarchists, because we all know we have a way of working, and we have to bounce that way across other people, and sometimes that causes some conflict. But you can solve it with words. You can solve it with just being patient, and that's something people forget a lot.
Right.
Even me.
He says they can't make a model. That's the whole point. There's no way to make a working model for something as complicated as climate. It's like a computer program. The models are still BS. And I agree. I agree with that. But like that's now. There are ways to do it. We just haven't found them yet, and that's what climate scientists are theoretically working on. Or they're just jerking off and talking about like penguins and their mating habits while on meth. But
mate, we're gonna have to cut this, mate. I'm afraid because I'm massively overrunning.
Yeah, well, and I figured
somewhere.
that because I think you said you had to like cut out exactly at fucking 5. So
yeah, I've massively gone over.
We'll address all these claims on some other broadcast. For now, we will see you. And apologies to the community who wanted to see their topics covered. We'll do all of these topics in addition to whatever else you have next Friday.
Definitely.
But see y'all next Monday for Bad Morning News and for Shit Shooting Sunday this Sunday.
Have a bad morning, y'all.
Bad morning.